Meir. I never went to 1 million. I never heard Kriyat Torah. It didn't. The shuls were all locked up. And here at Machon Meir, it was business as usual. They closed the. It was no one allowed in, no one allowed out. You were one family, Machon Meir, and they done them 3 times a day, every single day, throughout the whole of Corona. And then I realized that there are different rules for people who literally live in the palace. If you want to daven shacharis in the morning with a minyan, do you know what you need to do? You need to leave your house, right? Walk down the road, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, to get to shul. Do you know what these chaps need to do? Yeah, get out of bed. They live in the palace of the king. They have a Beit Midrash in their building, in where, you spend all day in a place with a Beit Midrash in it. Unbelievable. It's the greatest honor in the world. Oh, you're recording now? Oh, I can't believe it. Again. Okay.
You're going to get the rise.
Right. Okay, we'll start. No, that's perfect. We'll start right now. Okay, sorry, we were just talking about living in the palace of the king, which is Machon Meir. Okay, we're going to start. What I want to talk about today is, I want to talk about the topic of organ donation from people who have left this world after 120. There's a big halachic debate on whether organ donations is permitted or whether organ donations are forbidden for somebody who's, after 120. We're going to discuss the halachic topic of organ donation together, but it is not, our class today is not an attempt to reach a psak halacha. If you have a question of whether you should fill out an organ donor card or whether you shouldn't fill out an organ donor card, so that's a private question that you should ask, your rabbi. You should speak to somebody who is your rabbi and ask them one-on-one what you think you should do. We are only highlighting today a fascinating halachic debate, and the purpose of our discussion is to see, how different halachic opinions exist and how you can have different legitimate halachic positions. So we are much more here today about the journey towards a halachic answer, but we're not here to give the psak halacha. Beseder? We're here for the adventure. Is that okay? Exactly, thank you. Yes, excellent. Okay, that's Hakdama point number 1. Hakdama point number 2 is this. We may have another lesson about organ donation where we might talk about kidney, and we might talk about the cornea of the eye, and we might talk about various organ donations that are given after the heart stops beating. But that's not what we're talking about today. That is a slightly less controversial, or there's less issues to discuss on that, because the person is certainly dead, because according to all halachic opinions, the person is dead, and the only question is, after they're dead, are you allowed to remove the organs? That's an important question, but that's not our question today. Our question today is if somebody's heart is still beating, but they are what is known medically as brain dead. So they're the brain stem. There's no connection between the brain stem and the brain stem is dead. So you might have a brain and you might have a body, but they're not connected to one another. So what's the halachic? How do we view that halachic status? The heart may still be beating if the person's on an artificial ventilator. Would you be allowed to remove a heart, lungs, liver, all the organs that are donated from a person whose heart is still beating? Would that be permitted, or is that forbidden? That is our discussion for today, but not to answer the question halachically, but to discover the halachic journey. Is that clear? Okay, that's the end of introduction number 2. Questions, comments? Okay. So before we start, our class today is divided, I would say, into 4 parts. Part number 1 is a general discussion of organ donation, why it might be permitted, why it might be forbidden. That's the first part. Then after that first part, why it be permitted, why it might be forbidden. After that first part, which is quick, then we're going to go to defining the end of life. And we're going to look at 2 halachic definitions for the end of life. So what we'll do, definition number 1, definition number 2. So that's points 1, 2, and 3. So introduction, and then definition 1, definition number 2. And then in light of definition number 1 and definition number 2, we're going to look at modern halachic rulings based on which definition you go by. Is that clear? And as always, it will be the greatest joy in the world if you have questions, comments, ideas. At this stage, even if it's not 100% relevant, it's just interesting to hear your thoughts as we're going through this journey. Is that okay with everyone? Okay, everyone's got a sheet, right? Good. Okay, do you see this over here? Factors to forbid organ transplants, I'm sorry. So there are 4 arguments, 4 reasons to say that you should not be allowed to do organ donation. The first one is from the Bet Yosef. Oh, no, I was talking to somebody else about the Bet Yosef. Oh no, Bet Yosef. This is it. Tuvia, the Bet Yosef. Here we go. Bet Yosef, you're a Deya. It says like this. Met v'tachrichav asurim b'hana'ah. Dead body and the clothing with which somebody is buried, you're not allowed to derive benefit from it. Become a duchte is mentioned. This is mentioned in a couple of places. V'katav harashba b'tshuva delo shana ben meit goy le'meit Yisrael. It doesn't matter whether it's a Jew or a non-Jew. You're not allowed to derive benefit from a dead body. That's all clear to everybody. You all know. We spent the last few weeks prior to this week talking about Sifrei Kodesh, holy books. We started that discussion with a discussion of a Sefer Torah. I'm sure you know that according to Halacha, if you have a burning building and there's a dead body and there is a Sefer Torah, you save the dead body from being burnt before you save the Sefer Torah. So it tells us how important it is to preserve dead bodies. We believe that the human being is created b'tzelem Elokim. We're created in God's image, and therefore to derive benefit from a dead body is forbidden. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is halanat hamet. The truth is, all 4 of these points all connect to the same idea. Halanat hamet is delay of burial. You know, as soon as somebody passes away, you have to do the funeral as soon as possible. Here in Israel, they have funerals, apart from on Shabbat, where you can't have funeral, but they have funerals here 24 hours a day, because you're not supposed to have a body overnight inside Jerusalem. I imagine every so often it does happen, but the funerals here, as opposed to perhaps certainly in England, but perhaps in other places too, where you have funerals during the daytime but not during the nighttime. Here in Israel, certainly in Yerushalayim, maybe elsewhere as well, just because of this idea, you're not allowed to delay the burial. So therefore, funerals take place 24 hours a day here. Here the Torah tells us, "Lo talin lim lato al ha'etz." It's talking about if somebody is killed, is hanged as a punishment. You have to bury him. Ki kavor tikvorenu beyomahu, ki kilelat elokim talui. That's really the idea. Ki kilelat elokim talui. The Gemara tells us, you might be familiar with this. I'm going to summarize the Gemara and I won't read it inside. The Gemara tells a story of 2 twins. Do you remember? Did we ever discuss this before? 2 twins. One twin was a king, and the other twin was a gangster. The gangster got caught, and he was sentenced to death, and he was sentenced to hanging. So they took the gangster and they hanged the gangster. And then in the town square, then everyone goes to the town square, sees this body hanging in the town square, and they all assume it's the king. And then it causes like a terrible, like a confusion and absolute disaster. It's a terrible lack of respect for the king because everyone thinks that the king is being killed. You follow? Now, listen to this. This is such a powerful mashal. And there are lots of halachic ramifications of this idea. How's that story relevant to us? Do you know how it's relevant to us? It's relevant in the deepest way. We people are created. Every human being is created b'tselem Elokim, created in God's image, and therefore delay of the burial, kiviyachol. You see a dead body, you see HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You follow? And it's a disrespect to God for a body not to be buried on time. Isn't that a powerful idea? Now the ramifications of that are huge. This story of the Tzelem Elokim, people use it to talk about things like cosmetic surgery and harming yourself. You know, all these self-harm is all connected to, it's an act of disrespect for the human body. Even the Rambam, who talks about our requirement to maintain a healthy lifestyle, is because you represent your body is a Tzelem Elokim. It is created in God's image, and therefore a healthy body is a reflection of, like it's a sign of respect for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Is that clear? So again, obviously delaying a burial in order to remove organs is a problem. You follow? The first problem is benefit, second one is delaying the burial. The third one is nivulamet. Are you allowed to cut up a body? So nivulamet is all from the same idea that we're creating God's image. As you all know, autopsies are forbidden. You're not allowed to perform an autopsy on a Jewish body, or on any body. You're never allowed to do an autopsy in halacha. There is a very, very famous case, a case that's quite well known from the 18th century. The Nodab Yehuda. Nodab Yehuda lived in Prague. Anyone here in Prague? Anyway.
The one from Prague not appeared tonight.
Huh?
The one from Prague didn't appear tonight.
Oh, is he from Prague?
Yeah.
Chaim?
Yeah.
Oh, I never knew that.
Oh, actually, yeah, he's from Prague, but he left for...
Oh, interesting. Anyway, so the Nodab Yehuda was asked a very interesting question once about an operation an autopsy that was being performed in London. I remember it because it's London, that's where I'm from. And the question was, were they allowed to perform it? You're not allowed to perform the autopsy. In the end, if it's for pikuach nefesh, meaning if a life will be saved as a result of the autopsy, but not just a life in the future, but right now. There's somebody whose life is in danger, and performing this autopsy could save that particular person's life, then you would be allowed to do the autopsy. But otherwise, you would not be allowed to, because it is a disgrace of the dead. Finally, the last problem is stealing. Like, Elokai neshama shenatatabi. I'm not sure who's to whom is my, who has ownership over the body, in order to decide what to do with it. Anyway, so despite all these four concerns, deriving benefit, delay of burial, disgrace of the dead, and stealing, despite all of those ideas, you understand that there is an overriding idea that knocks all of them out, and that is pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh, exactly. Meaning none of these are more important. If there's a possibility of saving a life, then the opportunity to save a life takes precedence over all four of these concerns. Is that clear to everybody? Okay, good. Now, so really, based on this, it would seem that there'd be little reason to forbid removing a kidney from somebody who, according to all halachic opinions, is dead. You follow? The debate on organ donation is really about a situation where you remove a heart or lungs or whatever it is. I'm removing from a body where the heart is still beating. But once the heart stopped beating, really according to all opinions, it would be hard to find a reason to forbid donating organs at that stage. Is that clear? Okay. Now we're going to talk about defining the end of life. At what stage do we say that this person has left this world and entered the world to come? It's a crazy, crazy Mishnah. It's so interesting. I'll tell you what's interesting, because what Mishnah would I find that would help me define the end of life? Like where am I going to find a Mishnah that does that? But we're blessed with very creative rabbis, and look at this. There's a Mishnah in Yuma that tells us this. The Mishnah says, Yuma Perichet Mishnah Zayin, Misha Nafla Lav Mapolet. If a guy is going for a walk, and there happens to be that the walk is on Shabbat, right? Nafal alav mapolet. Mapolet is an avalanche. So guy's walking, and then it gets a little bit tricky. You follow, and he gets buried in his avalanche. Safek hu sham, safek eno sham. You don't know if is he there, is he not? Safek chai, safek meit. You don't know if he's alive or not alive. Safek oved kochavim, safek Yisrael. Mefakhin alav et hakal. You remove these stones. Matza'u chai, if you find him alive. Mefakhin alav ve'emed yanichuhu. So what the stones, you have this avalanche. There's a guy walking down the street, avalanche. The stones fall all on this guy. Now what's the problem with moving the stones? The stones are muktzah. And it's Shabbat Kodesh. I can't move the stones. But I'm allowed to move the stones if it's pikuach nefesh, right? But if it turns out that this chap has already left this world, so then I don't have the argument of pikuach nefesh anymore, and therefore I need to leave the stones. Is that clear to everybody?
In Shabbat?
On Shabbat, only on Shabbat.
But, oh, yeah. Right.
Oh, Yosef, you are such a gift. Thank you.
Just, remind, like, this is also like the image of Hashem. So I remember that someone dies in Shabbat, leave it there, and then the next.
Yes, I might just, you don't leave. As you probably know, we never leave. Also, as a sign of respect for a dead body, you never leave it by itself. So you're allowed to remove the stones, you're allowed to break Shabbat as long as you are working towards pikuach nefesh. But when it becomes clear that pikuach nefesh is no longer an option because the person has left this world, so then you would stop moving the stones because you're not going to save his life anymore because the person's left this world. You would not leave, you would then stay, obviously, and recite Tehillim and do whatever would be the appropriate thing to do, to show respect to the person who's just left this world. And then after Shabbat, you would clear up, and then that would be the end of that.
How do we know if the person died already? Maybe.
Oh, Mitsuyam, what an excellent question.
I believe we're moving towards that place.
Yes, Yosef, excellent question. The Mishnah just said, if he's alive, you remove the stones. And if he's not alive, then you can't remove the stones, and then you respectfully, pay tribute to the person who's just left this world at that spot until Shabbat comes out. Then Yosef asks the excellent question, how do we know if he's alive or dead? Oh, which is where we now come to our first definition of the end of life. Because the Gemara, on this very point, tells you what to check for. Check for this. If he's got this, he's alive. If he hasn't got it, then he's not alive. You hear?
Yeah.
So look at this, what the Gemara says. Tana Rabbanon, the rabbis thought this is a brighter. Ad heichan hu bodek. How much checking do you need to do? That's really quite nachon. What do you need to check for? So the Gemara says, ad chotmo. V'yesh omrim ad libo. Linyan pikuach nechfev. Ika chiyuta ba'apehu. Dichtiv Kol Asher Nishmat Ruach Chayim Ba'apav. So one person says you check, you check if he's breathing. That's what you check. You check if he's breathing. Do you check whether he's breathing by looking at his heart? Do you check if he's breathing by looking at his stomach? Or do you check if he's breathing by checking his nose? And the Gemara says you look by checking at the nose. And this is really, really quite interesting. You know, when God creates man in the book of Bereshit, God says, Vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim. Is that the pasuk? Vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim. That God blew into his nose, apav, af. God blew into his nose a soul. And now we see the Gemara over here tells us that when you feel there's no action in the nose, then you know he's left this world. So it's almost as if the soul enters the body through the nose and the soul departs this world through the nose. So how do you know someone is dead? You check the nose. You check if he's breathing, and you check if he's breathing, if he is breathing through the nose. Is that clear to everybody? Oh wow, that is a very, very important idea. I'll just tell you a very interesting halachic thing as an aside. I don't know if you know about this. I mean, I don't know very much about this myself, but historically, apparently, when people would sneeze, sneezing was a very, very, very dangerous thing to do. And the reason when someone sneezes, we say lavriut, to health, asuta. Why? Because people would die during the Black Death. Is that right? And is that right? That is right. Sneezing was, people would die through a sneeze.
Well, even nowadays today, people maybe aren't dying, but there are cases of people sneezing and pulling muscles in their back.
Yes.
Stuff like that.
But it's because the sneeze is really, the nose is a big player in the sneeze. No, it's all in the nose. So this is a very interesting definition of life, which seems to be about breathing. Is a person breathing or is he not breathing? Clear to everybody? Questions?
I have a question. So the body is buried, basically.
Yeah, correct.
How can we know? Like, are we allowed for the sake of
no, so we said we remove the stones. Keep removing the stones. Remove the stones because of pikuach nefesh. So there's a guy underneath. Remove the stones. Keep removing. Remove the stones. But then if you find out when you removed all the stones that under that rubble the guy is a dead body, so then, but you only stop removing the stones when you realize that it's a dead body. Is that clear to you? Okay. First of all, I realized, Nebuch, this person's left this world. This is no longer. And then I in the knowledge that the person has left this world, I can now there's no pikuach nefesh, and then I don't remove the stones anymore.
You're always looking for the head, right?
First. Exactly. That is exactly the case. Okay. Is that clear to everybody? Yeah. Excellent. The Shulchan Aruch rules likewise. If you have a look at this, Af matzu merotzet she'eno yachol lichyot ela lefisha mefakhin uvotkim ad kotmo. Just see, this is the Shulchan Aruch. Im lo hirgishu b'chotmo chiyut az v'ata met. Lo shana peka'o b'roshot tchila, lo shana peka'o b'raglav tchila. So he says it's all about checking if he's breathing. If you don't lo hirgish b'chotmo chiyut, if you can't see that he's not breathing, now there's no life in his stomach, in his breathing system, then he's certainly dead, and then you would no longer shalom uvracha. That will be the end of the story. Is that clear to everybody? Joy, happiness? Okay, that process that we just went through was a process from the Mishnah to the Gemara to the Shulchan Aruch. We didn't go through the tour on the Bet Yosef, but they would have corroborated everything we just saw. Everything clear to everybody until now? I've got a little question on it, but I don't have a good answer to this, and that is, if somebody's not breathing, if you are a first aider and you see somebody and they're not breathing, so what do?
You try to
Resuscitate, exactly. So the fact that someone's not breathing, doesn't mean they're necessarily
dead.
Yeah, nowadays we resuscitate, like there could be something in the airways, you have to unblock the airways. So either we're talking about where they try to resuscitate. You mean like to see if this person is capable of independent breathing?
Right, because independent breathing is like a criteria of whether he's
Exactly.
But nevertheless, there is raising the concern whether we should actually resuscitate people. Isn't this like the way of entering into divine plan for that particular person or something? So I remember there was debate about that.
So that's a very
premises we can actually
that's a very, very complicated question. What is resuscitation?
Yes.
That's a very, very complicated question. But we have to assume that the Gemara over here talking, if breathing is the factor, so what we're saying is we're going to try to resuscitate. If we see that through resuscitation there was like a blockage in the airways, and through resuscitation you get rid of the blockage, and now the person is able to breathe, great. So now this person is alive. But if you do resuscitation and they're unable to they're incapable of independent breathing, so then we would then that would be the end of that part.
Is it also the issue of life support systems as well, was helping people?
So I'm going to come back to that. That's a whole debate. That we're going to come to that in a minute. Is everything clear until now? Resuscitation, like whether it works or not. I remember somebody once told me that if somebody stopped breathing and they're resuscitating, the truth is I heard this about 5 years ago. I really hope it's better now. That the chances of success in resuscitation are very low, apparently. But I hope nowadays that's a terrible thing to say. I apologize, but Ezrat Hashem is different today. It is actually very, very high. Anyway, I just want to add one little story about resuscitation. When a few years ago, I was teaching this group, a very, very sweet guy, and they were, it was a group of people, they were learning in yeshiva for 3 months, then they went to the army for 3 months, and then they did first aid. They did a course in Mada, and they volunteered as first aiders for 3 months. That was a year program. And one of the boys worked for 3 months as a first aider in Mada, and then he came back to the yeshiva after he finished his time in Mada, and we were learning this topic, and I was talking about exactly this story about somebody who stops breathing, resuscitate. Do you resuscitate? You don't resuscitate. At what stage do you say the person is dead? So he told me a terrible story. It's really quite sad. He was on an ambulance. Can't remember what his name is. Yarden. He was on an ambulance, and they got called to an apartment. They went to the apartment, and there was a woman lying on the floor, and she wasn't breathing. So they got all their machinery out, and I've spent the last 6 weeks doing a course, training myself for what to do at this minute, and he managed, incredibly, to restore a heartbeat, and he managed to resuscitate this woman. Isn't that amazing? He managed to resuscitate this woman. Anyway, when this whole story happened, the ambulance came after 10 minutes. About half an hour later, the family started coming in. Oh, this is a terrible story. The family started coming in, and he told the family, guess what this guy just come from England for a couple of months in Israel, and he's literally just saved this woman's life. Isn't that wonderful? And the family all come in, and he tells them, we saw your aunt, and she was lying on the floor, and then I managed to resuscitate her and to bring her back to life. And do you know what the relatives said?
She signed
Oh my gosh, I can't even say it. Yeah. Why did you bother? Oh no, what? Isn't that terrible? Terrible, terrible story. Sorry about that, Tuvia.
I was trying to get that life insurance money.
I don't know what it was. Terrible story. Anyway, so our first definition is quite clear. It's based on the Mishnah, based on the Gemara, and then we see it in the Shulchan Aruch. If someone is breathing, independent breathing, they're alive. If they're incapable of independent breathing, then they're not alive. Okay, that's number one. Now we go to a story. Listen to this story. If you go to, we're going to go to the story from the Khatam Sofer. Khatam Sofer, if you go to the third paragraph says, the Khatam Sofer, Rav Moshe Sofer, lived at the same time as somebody else called Moses Mendelssohn. Have you ever heard of Moses Mendelssohn? A very interesting Jewish historic figure, sort of, although he himself observed halakha, but he had questionable ways of reaching halachic decisions, and the normative halachic community and Moses Mendelssohn did not agree with one another. So the Khatam Sofer, Rav Moshe Sofer, who was part of the normative halachic community, was asked a question, and the same question was posed to Moses Mendelssohn. The question was asked by the Duke of Mecklenburg. There was a town in called Mecklenburg. Have you ever been to Mecklenburg? Do you know what that is? No idea.
Probably German somewhere.
Yeah, right. Probably. Anyway, so you got this town, the town of Mecklenburg, and something terrible was happening in Mecklenburg. The terrible thing that was happening was that they were very eager to bury people as soon as they died, but every once in a while they would bury somebody although that person was still alive. You know all the ghost stories that you might have heard of as a child, of like people climbing out of graves, and they used to keep saved by the bell. Have you ever heard of that phrase?
Yeah.
Saved by the bell. Saved by the bell is because when they would bury, they would have a string, and then if the guy was still alive, he could ring the bell, and then you could dig them out of the grave and save their lives again. That's where the phrase "saved by the bell" came from, and it was all going on around this time in Europe. People were being buried too early. So the Duke of Mecklenburg said, "This is what we're going to do. From now onwards, the only time that you're allowed to bury somebody is you have to take somebody leaves this world, you take the body and you leave the body in the morgue. And you have to leave that body in the morgue for 3 days." Now, I don't know if you would know this, and Bezrat Hashem, we should never know this, but after 3 days, it's quite clear that, the body starts to decay. It's very clear, who's alive and who's not alive. And through that requirement of waiting for 3 days, they made sure that nobody got buried alive. So, the Duke of Mecklenburg approached all the different communities, religious communities, and said, "New policy, next time somebody in your community dies, we're not going to do the funeral on that day, you're going to do the funeral 3 days later." They told this to Moses Mendelssohn. He said, "Right, I understand." He accepted it. But the Khatam Sofer, Rav Moshe Sofer, did not. He said, "We in Halakha have a different definition of death. We don't wait for 3 days until somebody dies in order to know they're dead, but we have a different criteria to decide if the person is dead." And if we go to the Khatam Sofer over here, in source number 9, we see his definition of death. This is Rav Moshe Sofer responding to the question that was asked by the Duke of Mecklenburg. And this is what he says. Aval, kol shachar shemutal ka'even domem. If somebody is there as a like a rock hard body, ve'ein bo shum devika, and this is very important, the heart has stopped beating. Im acharke batel haneshima ein lanu ela divrei תורתנו הקדושה שהוא מת, ולא ילינו אותו במטמא לו, אם הוא כהן לוקה אחר ההתראה. So he says, we don't wait for 3 days. As soon as the heart stops beating and the body is hard and cold, we know that the person has left this world. So what's the Khatam Sofer done? He has given us a new definition of death.
So not breathing, but
Yes, it's not about breathing or not breathing. It's about,
But if the body's cold.
Yes, exactly. That is exactly the point. Shalom Aleichem, what a joy to see you. That is exactly the question. Is the body cold or not cold? That is the question. And then based on that, we'll know, is he alive or is he not alive? Now, this is a fascinating thing to say. Why is this fascinating to say? Because it is different to what we saw previously. In our Mishnah and in the Gemara, and then like subsequently in the Shulchan Aruch, what was the definition of death? Yeah, somebody is capable of independent breathing, then they're alive. If you're incapable of independent breathing, then you've left this world. But according to the Khatam Sofer, at his stage, there was no such thing as an artificial ventilator. But imagine if there was an artificial ventilator, he would say that you are allowed to. He would say that the person's still alive. The body's not cold, the blood is pumping through the body, so the person is alive. So according to the first definition, if somebody is hooked up to a ventilator, but they're incapable of independent breathing, they're dead. That's brain death. There's no connection. Meaning they're no longer capable of independent breathing means that the head is no longer communicating with the body. You follow? And therefore they're dead. But according to this new definition from the Khatam Sofer, no, he'd still be alive. And he wouldn't have been buried in Mecklenburg. You hear that? Now this has got huge, huge ramifications in the way that we view organ donation. Because if we go by the first definition, if somebody's incapable of independent breathing, and then they're connected to an artificial ventilator, and therefore they're brain dead, but their body is still pumping blood, you'd be allowed to remove the blood, remove the heart, remove the lungs, remove whatever you want to remove, because the person has already left this world. But according to the second definition, that of the Khatam Sofer, he's not stone cold, the heart is still beating, and therefore you would not be allowed to remove the heart. Is that clear? Okay, so we had our first part, that was our introduction, where we spoke about the 4 reasons to forbid organ donation, and then the reason that knocked them all off. We said halanata met, stealing from the mate, hana'ah from the deriving benefit from the met, but then all of those were pushed aside for pikuach nefesh. And then we had our first definition of death, and now the second definition of death, and we see the ramification of these 2 positions. The final part of our discussion is to see how modern halachic authorities have decided this halakha. Do they side with the first definition from the Gemara and then the Shulchan Aruch, or do they side with the second definition that we saw in the words of Rav Moshe Sofer? Is that clear to everybody? So we are now going to look at 3 positions. We're going to look at the Tzitz Eliezer, number 1. We're going to look at Rav Moshe Feinstein. And as you will see, Rav Moshe Feinstein divides into 2. He gave 2 teshuvot, and he wrote different things. So it's Rav Moshe Feinstein 1, Rav Moshe Feinstein 2, but that's person number 2. And then finally, we're going to look at Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, the 3rd position, to try to see what the halakha is. But as I mentioned right at the beginning, we're not giving a psak halakha here. We're just sharing with you the halachic journey. And if any of you have to decide whether to fill out an organ donor card or not, that's a private discussion for you to have with your with your rabbi. Joy. Good. Okay. Now let's start with number 1, Tzitz Eliezer. Rav Eliezer Waldenberg. I think he died around 2000. And he was a Dayan on the Jerusalem Beit Din. He lived near Machne Yehuda. Listen to what he said. It's source number 10. Do you see this? Anu Motzi'im, we find Smuchim Lo B'shut Chatam Sofer. Quotes a Chatam Sofer that we just saw a minute ago. Shekotev B'mshech Devarav B'zeh Lashon. Kol Shachar Shemutal Ke'even Domen Ve'ein Bo Shum Devika Im Achar Kach Batel L'Nshima Ein Lanu Ela Divrei Toratenu HaKadosha Shu Met. Hare appears from the words of the Chatam Sofer, just relay L'Hagon Chatam Sofer, to this the great teacher, the Chatam Sofer, the Bitula Neshima Mo'ila Likvo Et Amita Rakim Ba'al Achar Shemutal Ke'even Domen Ve'ein Lo Shum Devika. It's not about stopping breathing. We only look at stopping breathing after the person is turned as hard as a stone and there's no heartbeat. As long as there's pulse, as long as there is blood still pumping through this person's body, he is not ka'even domem. In the body, the skin is still soft. The body is still soft. That's still alive. Azai chosheshin shulai hu yotze min hakol v'yesh achush shema odenu chai. And therefore, according to the Tzitz Eliezer, a heart transplant is forbidden according to halacha. Why? Because you can only take a beating heart out, and according to him, the person.
Because the person is still alive.
Yeah, he's still alive. So according to the Tzitz Eliezer, Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, organ donations are forbidden. That's number one. Okay? Now let's go to number two. Number two is very, very interesting. We have Rav Moshe, you see 11 and 12 are both from Rav Moshe Feinstein. But if you have a look in source number 11, if you read the title, it's Igrot Moshe Chelek Yoredea Bet. So it's Yoredea Volume 2. Did you not get it?
It doesn't have, it only has 2 pages. So.
Oh, really?
Okay, I can show you.
I'm sorry. It's an opportunity to get to know Meir. He's a lovely guy. So if you have a look at source number 11, can you see it says over here, Igrot Moshe Chelek Yoredea Bet, Volume 2. And then if you go to source number 12, it says Chelek Yoredea Dalet, Volume 4. So you have a ruling from him, Yoredea Volume 2, a ruling from him, Yoredea Volume 4. Let's start with the first one. The first one, I believe, was written in the 1950s. No, must be later. It was after 1968, because that was the first heart transplant. And after the first one, so I guess in the 1970s, this is what he writes. Shtilat halev, heart transplant, she'etchilu harofim lasot bizman acharon, that people have started to do recently. So he must be writing in the early 70s, I guess. Hu ritzichat shnei nefashot mamash. It is forbidden. You're killing the person from whom you remove the heart, and you're killing the person into whose body you are putting the heart. The success rate of heart transplants was extremely low. Horgin biyadayim et mi shelachum mimeno lev ki adayin hu chai ולא רק על פי דיני התורה שנאסר בו חשיבות מיתה, אלא לדברי הרופאים שיש בהם שמגדירים באמת אומרים שעדיין הוא חי, אבל מצד רשעותם אין חושבים לחיות זו, שהוא רק חיי שעה, אף חיי ימים. It might be longer. Rav Moshe Feinstein is very, very critical at the beginning of the idea of a heart transplant. And the reason why he's very critical at the beginning for the idea of a heart transplant, he feels that people were not doing sufficient homework to make sure that it was safe to do this heart transplant. And you were killing two people, killing the person from whom it was being removed and killing the person into whom the heart was being transplanted. And therefore, Rav Moshe initial ruling is it's forbidden to do heart transplants. Is that clear to everybody? But now look at this. We get to volume 4. Between volume 2 and volume 4, a very, very historic medical breakthrough happened. Do you see this? In 1980, there was a significant breakthrough through the development of a new drug. I can't read this. Cyclosporin. Huh? Cyclosporin, thanks. That allows the body to accept the donated heart. Exactly. As you can imagine, the body, when something foreign enters the body, as a defense mechanism, the body obviously pushes anything out. The body doesn't realize that its heart is to do it good. And therefore, it was only when they developed this drug that was able to suppress the body's natural defense system that the success rate of heart transplants went sky high. And in light of this change, Rav Moshe Feinstein changed his opinion. Look at this. In source number 12, this is a very, very interesting idea because it shows how Rav Moshe Feinstein was very, very in tune with what was happening, meaning his answer in the 1970s was based on the information available to him in the 1970s. And the answer that he gives in the 1980s is based on information available to him in the 1980s. And this big breakthrough right in the middle there in 1980 is what changed the way we look at it. Look what he says. L'maaseh, k'fi sheshamati michatani harav hagaon harav Moshe David Tendler, I heard from my son-in-law, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, my son-in-law is Rav Moshe David Tendler. Rav Moshe David Tendler was a medical doctor, and therefore he understood the medical aspects of a heart transplant, and he informed his father-in-law of this breakthrough in the 1980s, and then went to his father-in-law to see how this might change his halachic opinion. And indeed it does. He says, Ha'arkaot kiblu rak et hagdarat hamavet shu gam tzodeket ledina. Hagdara shekorim leharofim, they call it like this. Habert kritina. I can't read that, but it's talking about brain death. Meaning they came to a new definition of death, which is brain death. And what is it? It is over here. The Tnaim lekfiat ha'asaka ha'muchletet v'asuvit shel hafalat hamoch. This sounds like somebody explaining what it is. Brain death is the cessation and the irreversible ceasing of brain function. The brain just stopped working. So you might still have a body and might have a machine pumping blood through the body, but the brain has ceased to function. Shenikra mitat hamoach. Do you see that? Mitat hamoach is brain death. Shenechshav mamash kenechtach rosho. It is the equivalent of decapitation. Nobody would say that decapitation is anything other than dead.
Secretion.
Yes, exactly. V'kasher mitkaimim t'nai mitat hamoach kvar mamash mitakel. V'hinei avsha lev adain yachol lidchof lecha miyamim. Even though somebody who is brain dead, the heart might still be breathing, mikom agom, kol zman she'ein lachol koach neshima atzma'it nechshav kamet. Do you see that? He goes, Rav Moshe Feinstein goes by the original definition, the definition that we saw both in the Mishnah, the Gemara, and the Shulchan Aruch. It's the ability to be involved in independent breathing. And according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, the position of the Khatam Sofer was not going against previous halachic teachings. He was in a very specific situation in his community, in Mecklenburg, where he had to make a proclamation to allow the Duke to bury Jews, not wait for 3 days. So therefore he came up with a definition of stone cold and then no heart beating, not as an indication that that is the Jewish definition of death, but rather, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, but rather what he's saying is that what the Khatam Sofer is saying is that we need to bury Jews immediately. We can't wait for 3 days. Please, if we go by this definition, allow us to bury immediately. And indeed, that's what they did. The Duke accepted the position of the Khatam Sofer. So we have, according to Rav Eliezer Waldenberg in the Titz Eliezer, he takes the words of the Khatam Sofer literally and says, this is the definition. If the heart is still beating, the person's still alive, and therefore you would not be allowed to do a heart transplant. And what Moshe Feinstein says, he goes, no, I go by the traditional definition of death, which is the cessation of independent breathing. And I base that on the Mishnah, on the Gemara, and then on Shulchan Aruch. And the statement of the Khatam Sofer was only being written for a specific need. Is that clear? Okay. So that's position number one that we had from Israel, Rav Eliezer Waldenberg. And then we had in America, Rav Moshe Feinstein. Now we come back to Israel. We go to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach lived here in Jerusalem, and he was the rabbi of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital. Many of the senior rabbis, the senior doctors in Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, consulted with Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach on Jewish medical matters. And the information that Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach received from the doctors with whom he spoke in Israel was different to the information that Rav Moshe Feinstein heard from his son-in-law, the doctor in America. And as a result, he says something else. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, in the final source, number 13, says, Ach, aval pikein hoil v'shasu v'poskim lo nizkar klal inyan shel mavet mochi ובעיקר מפני זה לא נראה כלל לעיניים וגם לא ברור עד כמה שהבדיקה היא כבר באמת מוחלטת, לכן צריכים עדיין לחכות עד שפעימת הלב תיפסק לגמרי ולהמתין אחר כך עוד חצי דקה, ורק אז אם הגוף מונח כאבן דומם דינו ממש כמת לכל דבר. ואת זה אינני אומר מפני שקיבלתי מכתב משלושת הרבים מומחים שומרי תורה ומצוות. So, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach follows the position of the Khatam Sofer, but for a different reason to the reason why the Tzitz Eliezer follows the Khatam Sofer. Did you get that? It was subtle, but it's very, very important. He says, I agree with the traditional definition of death, meaning it's like a combination of 1 and 2. I agree with the Mishnah and the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch. If you are incapable of independent breathing, then that's death. But the question is, how do I know when somebody is incapable of independent breathing? The research that was presented before Rav Moshe Feinstein was not convincing enough for Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who consulted with doctors here in Israel, was not convinced that with somebody is brain death, that it's irreversible, that they'll be incapable ever of independent breathing. It could be that his position will change. So really, he saw the Khatam Sofer not as arguing with the original, but rather explaining how can I measure. So everybody agrees that death is, like we saw when you check, there's no action in the nose. But how do I know when I've reached that? How do I know when that is irreversible? We spoke about resuscitation earlier, something that never existed before. So how do I know this guy may have stopped breathing, but maybe it's possible to resuscitate them, and maybe that will bring back changes. He wasn't convinced that I can be sure that the person is dead based on the definitions that were presented to him. And the only way you know they're dead is when the heart stops beating. You follow? But now look at this. Af al pi ken, על משמרתי עמדה, כמו שכתבתי קודם, שאין לסמוך בוודאות על המדע הרפואי, כל זמן שעדיין יש פעימת לב, אף שקרוב לוודאי שזה רק מפני המכשיר בלבד. He said, I can't be sure, and I don't want to rely exclusively on the evidence available to me right now. Now Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, died 30 years ago. So the advances in medicine today are huge compared to, the world in which he lived then. So it could be he left the possibility of, if there was a more accurate way to know that the person has stopped breathing, other than the heart stopped pumping. If the heart stops beating, we all know the person's left this world. But if it would theoretically be possible to come up with a different measure, I might have changed my mind. Unfortunately, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach passed away subsequently, and he never updated. We don't know what Rav Shlomo Zalman would hold today. So we have two positions that are clear. We know without a doubt that Rav Eliezer Waldenberg says organ donations are forbidden. We also know without a doubt that Rav Moshe Feinstein says that organ donations are permitted. So we have one on each side, and then Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is in the middle. He wasn't as emphatic, saying the only way is if the heart stops beating. But what he said was, the only way that I know that the person's incapable of independent breathing is when the heart stops beating. But if there would be in the future a different way of knowing that the person's incapable of independent breathing, maybe I might change my mind. But nobody today, I think, would have the audacity to say what Rav Shlomo Zalman would say for sure nowadays. And we're really left with these three positions. The position that says no, the position that says yes, and then there's a position in the middle that's more nuanced. And he wasn't saying no or yes, he was saying, let me see some more. Let me see some more evidence before I make my decision. And he wasn't granted the years to see that evidence. So we're really not sure exactly what to say about the position of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. What's interesting for all of us out of this debate is not to give a halachic ruling. Is not to say, and therefore you need to do this, or therefore you need to do that. Everybody will make their decision based on their discussion with their rabbi, and whatever, comes of that discussion. But what's interesting is how this is cutting edge medical advances that are happening nowadays, and how you can go to a Mishnah written 2,000 years ago and see how that Mishnah then is shedding light on how to find a halachic answer to a situation today. That's point number one. I'll add one more little point, particularly on Rav Moshe Feinstein. Notice how Rav Moshe Feinstein changed his mind. It's amazing to what extent Talmudic, or like the poskim, our leaders are sensitive to changes. So Rav Moshe Feinstein, based on information where the success rate was very, very low in the 1970s, before they developed this drug, so then he ruled it was forbidden. But then as soon as in 1980 they discovered this drug that had huge impact on the way that people had their heart transplants, Rav Moshe Feinstein changed his position. Now the rabbinic authorities are mamash on the ball, and as new information becomes available, they tweak halachic opinions in order to give us the most accurate psak halacha. Sweet, wonderful people, with that we'll pause. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, a joy and pleasure and honor to learn with all of you. Yishav koach lechem.